So we're now rolling into the unit that's probably going to be the most controversial of the course, and that's where we're talking about the theory of evolution. Now, before we get too wound up over this topic, I want to make note that it's important that we look at the information as it is presented, and that we want to acknowledge that there are going to be some people we come into contact with that are opposed to this idea or this theory, and we may have some internal conflicts ourselves. Regardless of those situations, we need to make sure that we are applying ourselves in an academic and professional manner. So one of our first things we're going to address with this topic is we're going to address misconceptions. It's very common for people to have misconceptions or misunderstandings about evolution, from the basics of what evolution is to the mechanisms behind it. And there are various reasons why people develop misconceptions or misunderstandings, and it comes from places like people we know, friends, families, even schools, the media. There's a lot of different sources for misconceptions and misunderstandings. It's not always intentional. Some people just truly misunderstand what was told to them or what they were taught, and then pass that misunderstood information along. Now, for this video, though, we're going to focus pretty much specifically on the misconceptions in this video and the arguments that can dismantle those misconceptions. So each of the points that we have here is a common misconception, and then the bullet points and letters underneath it are the arguments dismantling that misconception. So our first misconception is that evolution is not observable or testable, that somehow we don't actually have the ability to test or see evolution in action, when in reality we can observe and test for evolution on a regular basis, and entire careers have been spent doing so. That's why evolution is a theory, which we'll talk about that definition again a little bit later. There have been plenty of long-term controlled and replicated experiments where natural populations have been studied. There's a lot of really popular ones. There's one, populations of finches that were studied for over 40 years, with annual data being collected every single year. We have done experiments with guppies in pools and ponds that were natural, and then replicated those in a lab with replicated ponds and pools. So there's a lot of evidence out there. There's a lot of experiments that have tested for evolution and have led to observations of evolution in action. So evolution is totally observable and is completely testable. And that leads us to point number 2, or misconception number 2, that evolution's only a theory and that there's no proof. It's never been proven. This misconception comes down to a lack of understanding of the vocabulary that scientists use. So we have to remember the difference between colloquial and scientific definitions of theory. This is something we addressed really early on in the semester, but we're bringing it back because it's a very important piece, as this is one of the most common misconceptions that I've heard as an instructor and just as a scientist overall. Remember that when we're talking casually, we use the word theory more like an idea or a hunch, a prediction, or a hypothesis, that we're just kind of saying, I think this is what's going to happen, or I think this is why we're seeing what we're seeing, but without doing any sort of testing, without doing any sort of real academic work. So casually, theory doesn't really have much weight, but in science, the word theory is extremely heavy. There's a lot of evidence behind it, and so it's generally an accepted explanation for some sort of natural phenomenon and is supported by lots and lots of data. Scientific theories are generally accepted by the entire scientific community. So there's a big difference between how we use the word theory when we're casually speaking with friends or family and how scientists use it. Unfortunately, for some people that don't know that difference, they see the word theory in science and they apply it in the casual sense. We want to make sure we avoid that mistake. Misconception number 3 is that evolution is somehow goal-oriented and leads to progress and optimal solutions. Evolution is simply change over time. There's really no end goal in place, and there's no ideal creature. We as humans certainly are not it. There are plenty of things that traits that we have that are far from ideal. For example, we have made trade-offs to have very large brains, but the negatives to that means that childbirth is harder as the heads are very large. The fact that we're upright lets us move around in a bipedal position. However, it shifts our hips and makes childbirth really more difficult than other animals would have. So there's no ideal creature, including ourselves. There are trade-offs to everything. There's no perfect organism. That being said, there are some organisms that are more successful than others. So individually speaking, some individuals are better competitors in whichever sense than others. This is due to variations within the genome, and that individuals have different genetics, right? They have different versions of each gene. And this is primarily driven by the environment. We'll talk about the mechanisms behind this in some future videos, but we want to look at how the environment shapes what is considered a good fit or what's considered successful. And that's one of the reasons why evolution it doesn't have a goal or doesn't have an optimal solution, is because it's driven by the environment, and the environment can change and does change. And since the environment is ever changing, what's considered successful is changing as well. You can think of evolution more as a response to the change happening in the environment rather than some sort of process that has some sort of end goal in place. Going along with that, we can dismantle the idea of survival of the fittest. I say dismantling that because usually when people use that phrase, survival of the fittest, they're thinking the biggest, the fastest, the strongest, and that's not necessarily what's considered a good fit. Think of survival of the fittest more like how you would go and buy clothes for yourself, right? Having the biggest size isn't necessarily the best fit for you, right? You're going to buy the size of clothing that fits you, whether that's a large or a small or a medium or some other size. So survival of the fittest means the individuals who have the best fit for those conditions in the environment. So they are best fit for the environment. And if the environment changes, then who has the best fit can also change. Think of it, if you gain or lose weight, your then clothes won't fit as well. They might be too loose and baggy, or they might get too tight, in which case you have to then get different clothing. So it's the same kind of concept here. We want to make sure we understand what survival of the fittest really means. Number 4, the misconception number 4 is that there are no transitional fossils, and that because there's gaps in the fossil record that somehow disproves evolution. That is not true. We do see transitional fossils. But we also want to keep in mind that fossils are a mere snapshot into life back then. Fossils are really, really hard to make, basically. There has to be really narrow conditions in the environment for a fossil to develop, including what the animal was made of. So things like bones are more in hard tissues are more likely to fossilize, whereas soft tissues won't necessarily fossilize. And even then, you have to have the right type of soil, the right types of conditions over a long, long period of time for fossils to develop. So fossils are really just a small snapshot as to what was happening and what was alive at the time. Number 2, we can't possibly even dig up the entire earth looking for evidence. We know where to look in some cases to find fossils based on certain conditions and soil types, but it's not feasible to go and dig up everywhere that there could possibly be fossils. Fossils can be found in urban environments even, so you're not going to tear up a bunch of roads and people's homes and businesses to go get fossils. Also, some of these areas are in really remote, really desolate, hard to reach areas. So like up in the Arctic Circle, where you don't necessarily have buildings, and there's the risk of polar bears, and there's no restaurants or places to resupply yourself, and you can only get there via like helicopter. right? We can't necessarily spend our time up there digging there either. So, and lastly, that the fossil record does show that some currently living organisms resemble things of the past, but not always. And we'll talk more about that in a later video. We have found transitional fossils, including from dinosaurs to birds, because birds are direct descendants of dinosaurs. So like Archaeopteryx is a good example of something that looked somewhat like a dinosaur, but it was also becoming very bird-like. We've also seen transitional fossils between whales and their terrestrial mammal ancestors. And then one point I don't have up here, another really famous transitional fossil is the fossil known as Tiktaalik, which shows the movement from water to land by the tetrapods, so going from fish to amphibian. So we have seen in many different situations with many different organisms these transitional fossils which share traits from two different major groups. Misconception number 5 is that most biologists have rejected evolution. I'll just kind of read this quote off for you guys for this. Evolutionary theory has stood the test of time in serving as the most comprehensive scientific explanation for the diversity of life on Earth and is accepted by the overwhelming majority of scientists. You'll be hard-pressed to find a scientist, especially a biologist, who rejects evolution. Right? Usually if you're finding a scientist who is rejecting evolution, they're probably not even in biology. They might be in something like physics. But the overwhelming majority, we're talking about if you went into a room of scientists and you asked all of them, pretty much everyone in that room is going to say evolution is what is happening. We fully back and accept the theory of evolution as the scientific explanation for why we have the diversity on Earth that we see. And then the last misconception is the point of all this. We don't, as scientists, we're not concerned as for the why, right? So we're not necessarily looking at why do we see this change or why do we exist. We're not answering any of those sorts of existential questions. We're just looking at this process that is simple, elegant, conservative, and accounts for all the diversity of life on Earth. Now, like I said, it's important to take some time, digest these misconceptions and the arguments that we've made dismantling those misconceptions. I will warn you, and I've warned many classes on this because many students don't necessarily believe me on this, is that you may come across people who have these misconceptions, and when you explain them, if you explain them, they may become upset or angry or emotional. Our job as scientifically informed citizens is to simply portray what we know of as the truth, which in this case is based off of evolutionary theory, right? Based on the evidence, this is what we know of as the truth because that's what the evidence shows us. It's going to be difficult to have those conversations. A lot of times with these arguments, I'm not going to tell you how to change people's minds. That's a totally different class. Get into psychology if you'd like that. But I do want to warn you that if you choose to have those conversations, they may be uncomfortable at times. It's not necessarily your job to change people's minds, but it is your job to, at least as a scientifically informed citizen, to understand the misconceptions and understand the arguments that dismantle those. So keep that in mind as you're moving through, especially for those who are going to continue through science and further develop your science backgrounds, that you may come across individuals who are combative when it comes to the topic of evolution. And you may find even within yourself that there is some conflict. But it's the most important thing when addressing that sort of conflict, whether internal or external, is to look at the evidence. What do we know? And what does that evidence really mean in terms of what we know now?